By the clay fields at Choppington, she was walking. There were sulphuric flames in the air. There was the stink from the pit heap. And in the dark of night, you could see sparks and flames coming away from all of the ironworks in this place. But I'll tell you this. This girl, who was small and didn't really know what it was to be happy, pulled at a long straight hair. She was rich. She was spoiled. And now she was looking out of the brickwork factory window that was broken. She'd come to visit her father, and when she'd been visiting her father, then she got herself lost, and she'd wandered, not down, but further and further and higher inside of the brickworks. For the mine needed bricks for all of the houses of the workers, for all of the factories that would be by the side of the mine, and for the mine head itself. But as she'd been wandering, she'd gone higher and higher, up by the side of the chimney that would send out smoke and dust over everyone. Lots of people said that you could tell when the wind was changing, for all of the grass and all of the flowers would be covered with a faint pink brick dust. But this girl, she held a handkerchief up to her nose. It was small and it was embroidered. And she thought that she would come here to see all of the other poor children who were having an Easter picnic. They were having an Easter picnic here in 1857. And she thought that she would win the Easter egg competition because she'd got her nanny to help her to clean it, to help her to cook it, to help her to paint it, to help her to draw on it. And those poor children, well, they had to do whatever they could with a little bit of burnt stick. She'd used the finest of paints and crayons, and hers, she knew, would be better than anything that they could make. I've told you already she was spoiled. And it wasn't the way that she greeted people, talked to people, the way she looked down at people. But now, as she looked out of this cracked window, she was wondering how she was going to get out, because she could start to see the flames from the foundries leaping into the darkening air. As she looked out of the window, she could see that there was a bridge that led from one part of the mine to another. And she wondered if she was to shout, and maybe somebody would hear her. If she was to wave her handkerchief, then maybe somebody would see her. But a brickworks is filled with noise and people and talk and machinery that cuts at the clay and forms it and moulds it. And then there was the roar of the furnaces that would cook and bake the bricks. So no one was going to hear her, and no one would look up. But why would they? Why would they want to look up into that part of the factory? They were too busy with their heads down, getting on with their work. And anyway, if they did look up, they'd probably get brick dust in their eyes. Beyond the factory, there was a house that all of the children, even she, would say was haunted. There was an old man who lived inside of it, and she was the worst. She would shout at him, "Old man, dark as night. Old man, dark as night." And all of the children with her at the front would shout at him. But now she could see him standing in his doorway. She wasn't sure, even at this distance, on the far side of the factory, whether he would be able to see her handkerchief. She could see him. She could see him looking up. She shouted as hard as she could, but she'd been shouting for a long time. But the old man turned, walked down, and it seemed that he was going the opposite way, but she slumped herself down. In a corner of that room at the top of the brick factory, she found that there was a book that talked about all of the hours that people had worked inside of the factory. She was quite shocked. because you could see that they would work from 6 in the morning until 7 at night. They would have to work hard at moulding the clay and putting it into the shapes and putting it inside of the ovens, and it was hard, dusty, back-breaking, hot work. She could see that the dress that she had on her back would cost a workman's wages for 3 months. But she looked at the book, and as she rested her back against the wall, the door creaked open, and there she could see the old man, the one that she'd shouted at so many times, the one that she'd called so many names, the ones that she had led all of the other children to knock at his door and ring at his bell and shout through his window. He looked at her. "I know you. You're the master's daughter. I've heard you shouting at me, but I don't care. I won't let anyone, rich or poor, be stuck. And now, come with me, because your father will go absolutely crazy when he finds out how dirty you are." And it was true. At the top of the factory, she'd got covered in all of the brick dust. She dusted herself down. She followed him. He'd been one of the oldest workers in the brick factory, and now he was leading her a special way out of the factory so that she wouldn't have to go past her father, that she could get herself back home, that she could not be found out for having been lost and have run away from her father. As soon as she got back into the house, she changed her clothes, and her dress was clean and bright and sparkling, and she ran to where the other children were there having their Easter egg competition, and they could see her running towards them. Some of them sighed. She's bound to win. But she kept on running. She ran past the field. She ran past the factory. She ran to the old man's door. She placed on his doorstep a beautifully decorated Easter egg. She knocked upon the door, and she didn't run away this time. He came out. "Well, what do you want? I helped you once. I'm not going to help you again. I've got something for you." There was a different look in her eye this time. Not that spoiled look, not that "I'm richer than you" kind of look. She bent down, picked up the beautifully decorated egg and said, "I'd really just like to say thank you. Thank you for helping me, and thank you for not telling my father. Just thank you." The old man felt pleased with himself, that he taught that girl a lesson. But the best lesson of all was when he sat down by the side of his fire and cracked that beautiful egg open. Hard it might have been, but it tasted beautiful and salty on his tongue. And he smiled. Perhaps she might have learned a lesson this time. Just perhaps. The Grandad was an old soldier, and he was careful about everything. Careful with his money, but he wasn't mean. He was careful how he spoke to people, and he wanted his granddaughter to treat everybody the same way as he did, because he wanted to be careful in this world. He remembered when he'd been in the First World War and he'd been a soldier. He knew that you had to be careful with everything, careful with what you said. But their house was right beside Colliery Bay, but none of them had ever worked there. And he'd sworn that none of his sons, daughters, granddaughters would ever work at the pit. And that was just the way that he wanted to keep it. He wanted to make sure that none of his children would ever do anything as dangerous as going down the pit. But when war had broken out 2 years before, his son was called up. Well, it couldn't get much more dangerous than being in a war than working down a pit. He had the choice. He could have taken a job in the pit, but no, he did not want to go down the pit because his grandfather and his father had all said that none of them would ever work in that place. Now, the granddaughter was sitting not that very far away from the fire and sitting and watching her grandfather as he was reading the Evening Chronicle. All of the news was about the war, It was 1941. Things could have gone either way. No one could tell whether it was the Germans who would win, or, according to the Evening Chronicle, there was no doubt it was always going to be the British and the Allies who would win. But the grandfather would suck at his gums and look, and he would think, perhaps it might have been better if one of my sons had worked down the pit rather than go far away and leave the daughter with me to look after them. The granddaughter was pleased that the grandfather was there. It was always great comfort. He would say always the right things. But his ration book was getting thin, and he was using up all of his food to feed this growing girl. And reading about the war took even his smile from off his face. He tried to put a brave face on it, and he would smile and say, well, let's see what we can do tonight to find something good to eat. What shall we have? Will we have a roast suckling pig? Shall we have truffles with the turkey? When what they're really going to have was a bit of scrag end that was going to be boiled until it was just about edible. As they were sitting there, chewing on the meat and pretending that it was chicken or the finest veal or ham or beef, there was a whistling sound and a great thud. The old man had fought in the First World War, and he knew the sound of a falling bomb when he heard it. He was quite surprised that there wasn't a huge crack. He was even quite surprised that there was nothing more than a rustle. He looked outside, leaving the meat to go cold. He went outside and looked. And in the darkness, he could look and he could see that at the top of the coal heap there was an unexploded bomb. He had never set fire inside of Colliery B. His father and his father before him had said that they would never work down the pit. But now it was a case of, if he knew that the bomb was there and he left the bomb to go off, then they wouldn't have a house to come back to. It was unusual for him to have to scramble over the greasy coal, but that's just what he did. His granddaughter watched him. He went right up to the top of the great coal heap, and he might have worked in other places, at the brickworks, in the nail factory, on the river. So he was strong enough to grab hold of that bomb and pull it. She was quite surprised it was nearly as long as him, but he scrambled and he pulled and he pushed at that bomb, never thinking for a moment that it might go off. He pushed it and he rolled it and he pushed it right down into the river, and it was then that the air raid warden who saw him said, "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Get away!" Well, they did get away, and perhaps it was the fact that the water went into the mechanism, but the bomb never went off, and you could see people looking at him, covered in coal. Nobody had ever seen him use any coal apart from to put on his fire. But for him to be covered from the top of his head, over his nose, over his clothes, and his fingers and toes all covered with coal dust, they couldn't work out what had happened. Soon, every person inside of the town knew that the old man had saved them all by dragging the bomb across the coal heap so that it wouldn't explode close to the houses. The Grandad was an old soldier, and he was always very careful, but he couldn't believe it. As he walked down the street, people were smiling at him, nodding at him, winking at him. "You're a good 'un. You're a good 'un. You. You on the coal heap." And it was then that they sniggered, because everybody knew that he would never go anywhere near the coal. One day, later, much later in the war, the girl and the grandfather, they went along to the train station. Now, the grandfather hadn't told her why they were going to that place, but they looked at the coal heap. The girl pointed, smiled, gave him a knowing wink. "Bit like you, Grandad. Your coal heap was much bigger than that, wasn't it?" "Enough of that," said the old man. "Enough of that." The train, as it came to the station, hissed and fizzed and spluttered and sent great sheets of steam up into the air. And as they turned away from the coal heap, the girl heard a voice that she hadn't heard, not since the early days of the war. She knew it was him, the father, standing there. He looked a lot older, but even he walked up to his father, her grandfather, walked up to him and said, "What's all this I hear about you working in the pits?" Because a story as good as that one, of a grandfather who dragged an unexploded bomb across a coal heap, travelled far and wide, and had been heard at the front in the war by his own son. The three of them looked at each other, and then they all burst out laughing. "Enough of that, our lad," said the old man. "Dad," said the girl, "I can't wait to tell you what happened when Grandad became a miner." He was tired, which was hardly surprising, because his father and his brother, his older brother, and he all worked. He had 4 other brothers, and for all of the work that his father, his older brother, and he did, they got 6 shillings a week. 6 shillings, not an awful lot of money you would think, but it was just enough to get by. He knew that his younger brothers, they would soon be going to school. He hadn't been at school since he was 5, and now, after 4 years of working in the foundry, opening and closing the furnace doors, he wished that he could go back to schooling. His parents couldn't afford to pay for his schooling once he'd reached 5, and they needed him to start working so that they could all eat. But his father worked at the pit face, cutting up the coal. His brother worked at taking the tubs up to the surface so that the coal could be transported away. But he had the job at the iron foundry. He wasn't a strong boy, but he was tall and kind, as kind as he could be with what little that he had. And he always thought that he never got to see the sun, for he would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and he would not get home until past 6 at night. All he did seem to see was the inside of the iron foundry, with the heat and the smoke. Now, he knew that when he went to work, that he would see the sons. He would see the sons of the pit owner. They were always washed and clean, and he wondered what that would feel like. At his house, they only had dirty water that, well, since he was dirty in the first place, there was no point in washing in dirty water anyway. But he could see them sometimes, and he wondered what it would be like not to work. And he would wish and he would dream about the time when he was at school and what that felt like and how he would love to go back to school. But here he was, at the end of his shift, walking his way on the first day of winter back to his house. He wondered what it would be like not to work. But now he was throwing stones into the river Wansbeck. And on the other bank of the Wanney, he could see that one of the pit owner's sons was standing there. He was throwing stones to scare the ducks. He had a soft toy in his hands. The boy looked at him. He knew that he had the chance of schooling. But this boy, sickly as he was, with his skin as white but covered with the dust from inside of the foundry, decided that he would cross over the Wansbeck and talk with him. The boy, the rich boy, the pit owner's son, was quite taken aback when he first started to talk to him. But the two of them, like any boys, they started to play games. They threw stones and they watched sticks float down the river. But it was then that they heard a tick-tack, 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 tick of an old woman. It was the tutor of the rich boy. She was coming along. She was saying to him, "You should be at your lessons. Never mind wasting your time with this." And she did really look down her nose at the poor boy. "Then wasting your time with this urchin." The boy looked. He'd never really met anybody who had such clean clothes. Never met anybody who had spoken to him like this, and he didn't like it. But he wasn't going to let anyone speak to him like that. "I might be poor," said the boy. "I might be poor, but I would like to learn." "Well, that's more than this boy." And here she grabbed hold of the pit owner's son's ear and dragged him back to the house. He would have loved to have gone to school. He'd once been told by his father that he would be given a pencil to himself, and some old scraps of paper that he could write on the back of. The next day, the snow fell heavier and the Wansbeck was fuller with all of the snow melt water, and who should be there but the pit owner's son. "Can't stand her," said the pit owner's son. "She's always telling me what to do, and I don't like schooling." "Well, I tell you what," said the boy who worked in the foundry. "I tell you what, give me a chance to do your work with you, and maybe it'll be more fun if the two of us do it together." And that's just the way that it proved to be. For the pit owner's son realised that this boy, for all he had no schooling, was even cleverer than him. The two of them studied hard. It almost became like a competition. I'll tell you something. In the foundry, the boy, well, by accident, let them know that he could read and write. And he was given a better job than opening up and closing the furnace and the heat and the smell of the foundry. He was given the job of filling in the orders, and nobody could understand why such a young boy could read or write, but he wasn't going to tell anyone. And with that chance meeting by the side of the Wansbeck, where he'd wanted to learn how to read and write, he'd studied hard, he tried hard, he read books as if they were fine meals, and he was the hungriest boy in the world. Soon he found himself with more than 6 shillings in his pocket. He would earn nearly a whole £1 a week. That £1 became £2 a week. The whole of the family could eat properly, but the money that he used it to make sure that his 4 younger brothers could go to school. Not like him, where he taught himself. They would sit and they would learn, and he promised himself that he would make sure that they would read and write and never feel hungry. He was supposed to be in Sunday school, and he knew that because he'd had a wash. It was the only day of the week that he did have a wash, and he was told that that was what he had to do. And if his mother and father told him that he had to do it, then he would have to do it. And so on a Sunday, he would be scrubbed clean, and he would have to go to Sunday school. Now, he had made his older brother angry, and here in the middle of 1820, he was finding it hard to tell his older brother that he had let his favourite pig out of the field, because he lived on a farm with his mother and father and older brother, and they had pigs to look after. Pigs to pen, pigs to wash, pigs to clean, pigs to make sure that they kept fit and healthy and fed them. And they weren't really supposed to have them as pets, but since they had nothing else, then they each had a favourite pig. And just to make his older brother angry, he'd let his older brother's favourite pig out of the field, and now he was hiding inside of the pen, washed, but covered with all of the muck that was on the ground, all of the mud. It was a wide farm field, and there was a terrible smell in the air. You could hear his brother stamping around, screaming, yelling, shouting and crying. Because if he'd lost that favourite pig, then there would have been everything to pay for. He wouldn't go out ever. He would have to work twice as hard to make up for the money that they would have lost from the farm with not having a pig to take to slaughter. The boy, hiding inside of the pig pen, could see that there was an old suckler there, a huge old sow, and she had not 1, not 5, not 10, but 12 piglets all squeezing around her so that they could feed. The boy could feel all of the piglets as they were scratching around, and as they scratched around they moved the mud and splashed his face and made his clothes even dirtier than he was already. He wondered what he could do. He looked, and pigs will pick up things and take them back inside of the pen to play with, and he could see that there was a scrubbing brush, an old scrubbing brush with 2 initials scratched into the back of it. He looked at it. Now, he didn't like schooling, and he didn't get an awful lot of it, but his father had said that he would be able to write his name if it was the last thing that he could do, because his own father, he could barely put a cross on anything, contracts that were signed from the farm. But he looked and he could see that the last letter, J, was the same as his surname, because that was his name. James. It was one of his father's jokes to call him the same as his father and his father before him, James Jr. Not 1, not 2, but 3 J's to his name. But this looked like an old scrubbing brush, and it was A. James. Now he knew his brother, he was Charles James, and his father was John James, but his grandfather had been Anthony James. He didn't remember his grandfather that much. It was a hard life on a farm, and he died when he'd been a young boy. And now James was thinking, my grandfather must have used this, and perhaps I can use it on myself. And he used that old scrubbing brush to try and clean his good Sunday clothes, but there was no use in all of that. No use in any of that, because he was just too muddy and too smelly and too dirty. James pushed his head out of the pig pen. You could see that the sun was shining. You could see that the flowers were waving in the breeze, and they made a sweet smell in the air, as far away from the smell that he had on his skin and his clothes. There was going to be a party at the church, a Sunday school party, but there wasn't much chance of that happening, not the way that he was. He thought that his brother would be able to go to the Sunday school party. But then, just as he popped his head out of the pig pen, he could hear his brother. Oh, Lord! So there you are! What do you think you're doing letting me pig go free? I've no idea where it is! James jumped up and ran out of the pig pen, slipped, tumbled and fell down by the side of the river. Now down by the side of the river there was a path, and there, snuffling for anything that it could find, was his brother's favourite pig. He couldn't believe it. I'm going to get you! He knew what he would have to do. He'd have to climb on its back, grab hold of its ears and try and steer it as best as he could and wrestle it back up the hill and back onto the farm. But pig or no pig, it will do just exactly what it wants. and it didn't want to go up and back into the field. It wanted to go down by the side of the river, but with a boy wrestling on the top of its back, it slipped and tripped and fell into the water with a huge and a terrible splash. James was now dirty and very wet, and the pig was enjoying wallowing around by the edge of the river. His brother, who had been so angry, when he saw his brother dripping wet, he looked at him and he roared. "If you help me get that pig from out of the river, I'll say nought to a dad. Is that all right?" James couldn't believe it. His brother was going to forgive him, and the two of them, they laughed like they'd never laughed before. They screamed as they'd never screamed before, because trying to get a pig from out of a river is not the easiest thing in the world. But the two of them, they stood at the top of the field with the pig now pushed back into the pig pen. And it was then that the mother and father came out and saw the two of them, soaking wet, dripping and covered in mud. The father looked and said, "What do you think you're doing?" James was going to say, "It was me, I'd let my brothers," but his brother said, No, it's okay. James has been helping me. My pig got away, and he helped me to get it out of the river." Out of the river? The father and the mother looked at their two dripping sons. They laughed, all of them, as a family. The church bells started to ring. They might have missed the Sunday school party, but the four of them, they sat down by the side of the river, and that story was told from father to son, from that son to his own son, the day that James helped his brother. This boy would try and stop anything. He would try and stop anybody who was playing a game. He would try and stop anybody from getting from one place to another. He would do anything he possibly could to delay anything, especially when it came to having to go back and work in the fields. Because his father was the first in all of his family who'd ever got a job working on the trains. And if he had a chance, he would stand by the side of the lines and he would wave to his father and try to delay him. But his father would say to him when he got back home, "You know, you've got to be very careful. I can't just stop the train for anyone and anything." The boy remembered back to when he'd been much younger. His father was so proud when he'd been given the job as an engine driver to pull the coal wagons along by the side of the fields. And that's where the boy was now. When he was younger, his father would let him stand on the footplate. But now that he knew that he had jobs to do, back at the farm with his grandfather, he would wave him off. "Go on, you can't delay me anymore." So now he'd wasted his time by the side of the slow-flowing river. He'd wasted his time feeding the animals, who were quite capable of feeding themselves. And he pretended to himself that he was running back home so that he could get on and help his grandfather in the fields. But he wasn't running as quickly as he possibly could. I don't know what it was that was making him sort of run so slowly. Perhaps it was the fact that he loved to be in the fields. But as he was running by the edge of the train tracks, he could see something. He could spot something on the line. Now, his father wasn't always angry at him. I'll tell you this. His father, when he would get home, he would take pieces of tin plate and brass and solder them and make a small engine. Not a one that could run on tracks, of course, but an engine nevertheless, like the ones that they used in the pits, that would draw the water from out of the pits so the miners could go down and the pits wouldn't be flooded. So he knew a lot about lots of things. His father had made him some tracks, some train tracks out of old nails and pieces of wood, so he knew how a junction box worked. And it was something that he spotted. There was the signal, and the signal was up and at green. But when he looked at the tracks weren't pointing the way that they should have done. He'd spent a lot of time by the side of the train track, as well as dawdling and wasting time. But he knew that there was something wrong. The signal said go, but the lines said no. How was he going to tell his father? How was he going to get his father to stop the train? Because if he was to go over the tracks in the way that they were, then the train would crash and all of the coal would be spilled and no one would make any money and the miners wouldn't get any money at all. He tried everything he possibly could in the past to get his father to slow down so he could jump on and stand on the plate and sometimes pull the lever, or at least pull the cord that made the whistle blow. Now he was running. I mean, really running faster than he'd ever run before, because he knew the schedule and he knew what time it was and he knew that he must stop his father, and he ran as fast as he could and his father could see him, and again he waved him away, get out of the way. But his shouting, screaming, yelling, bawling, he did the only thing that he thought that he could do, and that was to take a stone. He took a stone and he threw it, and it bounced off the funnel of the engine. His father was furious. Get away! Just wait till I see you! But the boy was running. Now, his father was slowing the train down because he knew that he was coming to the junction. But if the tracks weren't set right and it said go, then the train would derail and his father and the train would come from the tracks, and he knew it would be a great disaster. He ran as fast as his legs would take him, all the while picking up stones, flat stones, round stones, stones that he could, and he kept throwing them. His father was shaking his fist, and I don't know what it was. He tried to delay everything and slow everything down in the past, but for no reason. But his father could sense that there was a look in his eye, that told him that perhaps for once he should really slow down. His father pulled at the great brake. The engine wheels spun around, trying to slow the train down. And it was then that the father could see what it was that his son was trying to tell him. Or the engine said that it was all right to go, but the tracks, he could read the tracks, were saying to stop. He wondered if he'd be in time. With all of his might, he pulled on the lever. The wheels tried to reverse. Sparks flew from off the rails. And it was just as they reached that junction box that the train did derail. But the train wasn't travelling at speed, for the way that the boy had got his father to look meant that he'd slowed the train down. Oh yes, it was some job to get that train back on the tracks. The rails were crushed and bent, and the wheels and the train was incredibly heavy. They had to send for another train with a crane on its back to Middlesbrough. The boy had never travelled that far before. But his father, as a reward, let him travel with him to Middlesbrough to pick up the train with a crane at its back, so that the coal train could be put back onto the tracks. He felt so proud, standing beside his father. His father had said, "At first I did not know what you were trying to do, but it was just the look in your eyes, that told me that I should take notice." The boy, from that time, took notice of his father. And the only thing that he didn't delay was the fact that he learned how to shovel the coal into the boiler of the train. And he worked his way up using a shovel to put coal inside of the boiler. He worked his way up to become a footplateman, to become a driver. And by the time that he was fully grown, he spent all of his life on the trains, and every time that he would go past that junction, he would smile to himself and think of how it had been a place where he'd learned a lesson in his life. And he always carried a stone in his pocket. And when he would go past that junction, he would pull on the whistle and throw a stone out by the side of the tracks. And when he retired from working as a driver on the trains, he felt proud to see there was such a huge pile of stones by the side of the track. Things had always been tough for this girl. A tough life, no money, and by the sea at Camas, she would have to go out in the boats with her brothers and her father and catch fish. She would throw the nets out and pull the fish in, but this was the only thing that was rich in her world, because she could not stand the taste of fish, and yet she spent all of her time out at sea, throwing the nets out, catching fish, bringing them in. And one day, no, not just one day or any old day, it was in 1958, Christmas Eve. Even on that day, there was a need for fish for the people. She wondered that if every one of these fish was a piece of silver, then she would be rich indeed. And as they set sail to go out and catch fish, it was rough and it was rocky by that place. And as she looked out, she could see the huge rocks. Now, she might have been a young girl, and she might have had to tie her long hair back, but she knew these waters very well indeed. And anyone who was foolish enough to go out on such a terrible night, unless they had to catch fish, then they were great as fools. That's all she could think. The greatest fools in all of the world. But it was as she got into the boat and they pushed away from the shore, she could see that there was a light on the horizon. It was no fishing boat that she would know. The men at the quayside would call her and shout at her and say that it was men's work and there was no place for a girl on the sea. A mighty superstitious lot they all were. But as she was pulling the nets back in, she looked and she could see that there was something floating in the water. She wasn't sure what it was, but it did look like a purse, a woman's purse. Her fingers itched to reach towards it, to pull it out of the net, to have a look at it, to see what was inside. But she had fish to catch, and she put it to one side on the side of the boat, and all of the silver darlings, the fish, flapped and floundered about. It had been a good catch, but she hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted this for a Christmas Eve. She hadn't wanted this for a Christmas. And now she looked, and by the edge of the rocks she could see that there was a man clasped and clinging to the rocks, someone that she knew very well, one of the men who had called her the worst of all names by the side of the quayside when they'd unloaded their fish. She looked at him. She couldn't believe it, or she wasn't sure, that in his eyes there were tears, for he was clasped and clinging to that place. Just to make sure, she pulled out a telescope and looked at him, and she could see him. "Please, anybody help me! Please help me!" It was almost as they got closer to him, and that he could see him wishing that it was somebody else other than her who had come to help him. But she used a long wooden pole, reached out towards him, shouted to her father to bring the boat closer to the rocks, closer than he'd ever been before, and he took a leap of faith. He might have called her names down by the side of the quayside, but he trusted her enough to save his life now. She was strong from all of the throwing of the nets out and pulling them in, and now she was strong enough to hold onto that pole, that wooden pole, to drag him onto the side of the ship. She could see that the purse that she'd found wasn't a woman's purse. It had been his. It would have made a very good Christmas present if she'd kept it. But even she, with all of the names that she'd been called, she couldn't keep it. With a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, she handed him back his leather purse. If she'd kept it, the money would have burnt a hole in her pocket with guilt. But as it was, he was so grateful to her. He opened up that purse, and all of the money cascaded into her hands, and she and her father and her brothers and her mother had the best Christmas of all. And when she went down by the side of the quayside, I've got to tell you, it wasn't a case that all of the men stopped calling her names, but there was one in particular who had always been the first to call her names. His mouth was always closed. His mouth was always closed, and he would smile at her and whisper in her ear, "You've been a good girl. You saved me. A good girl, that's what you are. A good girl on the sea." This had been the rainiest spring that anyone could remember. 1848 seemed to have been wetter than any time that she could remember. She'd been born in 1840, and she hadn't had that many springs in her life. But now, this girl who would get lost on her way home was visiting her favourite uncle. He had always come to them, but this time he was asking them, the whole family, to come and visit him in Northumberland. She quite liked the sound of Northumberland. She thought that it sounded as if the whole place would be filled with Vikings. And as she came on the newfangled train, she looked and she couldn't believe it. There was a lot of greenery, but the villages seemed to have in their middles factories and foundries and mines. So where there was once always green, now there were chimneys that were belching out thick black smoke. But this girl, who thought that she would just go for a short walk, had wandered, and as she'd been wandering, she'd been thinking, and she could hear the sound of the river. The river was in full flood, because I've told you already, 1848 was a very, very wet spring. The river looked very clean, but it rushed past, and it was then that as she looked, she thought it would be time for her to go home, because she didn't really know where the river was. She couldn't quite remember where her uncle's house was. It was a good place, a big place, for he was a part owner of the pit. As she looked, she could see that there was a boat that was caught on the fast slurping waves of the river Wansbeck. There was someone at the other side, a sound that she didn't really recognise, but it was of machinery. It seemed like the quiet sound of birds and water and wind blowing through the trees was replaced by the constant thud and crash of machinery. She wasn't used to the sound. Even in the city where she lived, even in the city, it was perhaps the sound of horses and carriages as they would clip, clop, clip upon the cobbled streets. But this was a sound of... It was almost like a sound of thunder, but it wasn't that dark. Now, she wondered if she could find her way back to her uncle's house. She looked. There was a fisherman, but he looked burly and strong, and his hands were hard and heavy. He had that fish hook, and she didn't really like the way that he looked. But it was then that she saw that there was a girl by his side. The girl was about the same age as her, but this girl, and she couldn't believe it, this girl She was wearing trousers. I'll tell you, she gasped. I have never seen a girl wearing trousers. Oh, you haven't seen a girl wearing trousers? The things that she thought she'd said only inside of her head, she'd spoken out loud by the side of the fast-flowing river. Well, I tell you what, if you had to work in the pit, then you'd wear trousers too. That coal dust gets everywhere. These are just a pair of me dad's old duds, but I tell you what, I like wearing these trousers. That's right, isn't it, Dad? The fisherman, her father, just nodded. He had no time for girls' talk. Oh, and not only that, I've got, and here, this girl dressed in her trousers pulled from out of her pocket a huge hook. I use this to pull at the coal to make sure that they're all the same size. I tell you what, though, I wish there was some way we could do it that wasn't by hand. But me and me mother will work on the screens. We make sure that the coal's all the right size and all of the best grade. I tell you what, I'm very good at it. Everybody's very proud of me. Isn't that right, Dad? And her father still didn't speak. That's true. And he just kind of nodded. Because to him, he had no time for girls' talk. I have to scrape and pull, and that dust goes everywhere. And it was true, because she could see that the girl's cuff to her shirt was tied round with a piece of string. The bottom of her trousers were tucked into her socks, and on her feet she had pit boots, which obviously weren't her size. Oh, you're looking at them, are you? Well, not only do I have to wear trousers, I have to wear pit boots. Those great lumps of coal, I tell you, when they fall on you, they'd knock a toe off or two. Just as the girl was speaking, a bird fluttered in one of the trees. The girl looked up. Oh, aye, there's plenty of birds round here. Mind, it's hard to tell. They all look a bit like crows and rooks. They get covered in the smoke and the dust. Anyway, I tell you what, I haven't got time to be wasting here. By the looks of you, there was a choky look in her eye. By the looks of you, you're not short of a bob or two. I tell you what, if you know any of those men who own this pit, tell them they could give just a little bit more wages, especially to the likes of some of the hard-working children like me. It saddened the rich girl to think that only by the fact that her father had money, her uncle had money, that she would have been working by the side of this girl, pulling and scraping and pulling and plying at the coal to make sure it was the same size, having to wear trousers and pit boots, and being as black as the coal that was pulled out of the ground. She could hear her father, her mother and her uncle all shouting for her. That's right, you get yourself back. And remember, have a bit of a word with some of them toffs who live up at the top of the hill. It's not an awful lot of pay for an awful lot of hard work. Isn't that right, Dad? This time, the pitman spoke, for he'd been listening to his daughter. You're right there. You're right there. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of work for not much pay. I think you should have a word with them. The rich girl had been shocked. The rich girl was surprised, not just by the trousers and the pit boots, but by how little money they got. When she grew older, she decided that she would use all of her influence with all of her family to make sure that the children didn't have to work so long and so hard or for so little. Perhaps it was a good thing that she got lost on her way to home. Perhaps it was a good thing that she travelled up to try and find out where her uncle lived. Because with that meeting, she made sure that not everyone stayed poor while the rich got richer. She used that meeting by the side of the Wansbeck for all the good that she could. Everything seemed to have changed. The century was only 10 years old, and now she was walking her way back from work. She hadn't always worked in the factory making nails. In fact, when she was younger, she had worked on the farms that she was walking past now. She could remember, before the century had changed, what it had been like when she'd been a girl. The fields were all green, but now, in the heart of them all, there were mines and pits, and that is where her husband had worked. It was a good job. There was lots of work to do, and with the job working in the pit, they got a cottage, and the cottage was filled with themselves and their 7 children. But they always made do. They could make and mend anything. And her husband would go off and he'd work down the pit. It was dark and dangerous work, and the house was good and the money was coming in, but then there was the disaster. The coal damp had set fire down in the pits, and the ceilings had fallen in, and his body was never found. But I'll tell you, the house that they got was tied to the job that he had, and when he was dead, whether she was a widow or not, then she was turned out of the miner's cottage. And that was why she'd had to find work for herself. Herself and her 2 oldest boys. The rest of them could do a little bit of work here and there and get maybe 2pence a week. But she was working hard in the nail factory on the outskirts of Bedlington, and now she was walking back towards the house that they'd found. It seemed like the money wasn't going very far, but she would work in that place, and she smiled, and now it was the 3rd day of winter. And as she was going back to the house, there was something that brought a smile to her heart. It was a picture that was drawn by her husband on the back of a slate. He wasn't in the picture, but he'd scratched at it with an old rusty nail, and it was her and their 7 children. And even though he wasn't in the picture, it wasn't just the fact that he'd marked his name with a cross at the bottom. It was the fact that she could remember the day that it had happened. It was there, on the mantelpiece. But as she was walking back towards her house, now it was back-breaking work in the nail factory. She would have to carry 60 rods that were sharpened with the machines. Now, she'd heard the other older women talking. In the nail factory, they used hand-operated machines. A handle would be turned to shape the nail and sharpen the nails. But now, in 1810, water-driven and steam-driven machines were taking over. It was loud and noisy and heavy work. For these rods that she would carry, she wouldn't just carry 1 rod between her fingers. It would be about 60 rods, and that weighed about 60 pounds. And they were not that much shorter than her, 4'6" long, 60 rods over her shoulder. When her husband had been alive, she wasn't weak, but she wasn't like she was now, strong in her arms and determined. But as she was making her way back from her work, she had to go past the old farm, the farm where she had worked when she was a child, and the coal ponies were coming up to the side. They were nearly as hungry as all of her children. The 2 oldest boys were really hungry. They would eat everything that wasn't nailed down. In fact, if they had the chance, they would eat the nails as well. But the coal ponies were brushing themselves up against the old wooden fence and nuzzling towards her. Perhaps it was something that they could smell on her that made them recognise her. She stopped her walk, and she pulled some grass from the other side of the field that they couldn't reach even when they strained and stretched their necks. And she took up a bundle of the grass and held it up towards them. But it was winter now. There was snow in the air, but not on the ground. And as she reached towards these 2 coal ponies, she started to speak. I bet you're as tired as I am. Hard work, isn't it? Pulling the coal. You would have known my man. He was a good man. Clever too. Never got any schooling, but he could draw anything. Anything at all. What he couldn't draw. And here she stretched her arm out just a little bit further, and it was a hand that brushed against the thorns of roses. The roses had gone, the flowers were gone, the smell was gone, but the thorns still remained. And it was as she reached with her arm and her hand that one of the thorns scratched at her. Oh! She was used to the nails as she picked them up and carried them, cutting her hands. Oh, her hands were rough and hard. And she sucked at her hand where the blood was dripping down onto the cold ground. And it was as she looked at the thorn, she had an idea. The next day, she went into the factory. She walked, as bold as you like, up to the overseer, the man who would make sure all of the nails were the right size and right shape, and she said, "I have an idea." He looked at her. "So you have an idea, do you? Well, very good. Keep it to yourself and get on with your work." "No, I've really got an idea. An idea that will make the nails quicker and cheaper and faster." The overseer was just about to send her packing again. But he looked. "So what is it then?" She explained to him that as she'd been scratched, she could see the thorns were sharp and straight, and if the nails were to be made in the same way, instead of them being rounded and sharpened and cut, if they were to be taken and at one and the same time they were cut and split and made with a head that would cut into the rods that she'd been carrying, and she knew them very well, then they could make nails quicker, faster and cheaper. The idea was taken to the managers. The managers took it to the owners, and a deal was struck between the owners and her that she would get 1 farthing for every 4 nails that were made with her new process. Instead of the nails being fed into the machines that were driven by steam, they wouldn't just sharpen them and cut them. In one go, they would cut, sharpen, and give them a head. It might not sound very much, a farthing for every 4 nails that were made, but everything was changing. This was a new century. Everyone was wanting factories and workers, and everyone needed to live somewhere. Years later, she went down by the side of the road where she'd used to walk, by the place where she used to work, and she smiled now, for she had beautiful clothes upon her back, for there were many hundreds of thousands of nails made, and with her getting 1/4 of a farthing for every one that was made, she now had money in her pocket. She had riches, good clothes, good food, schooling for her children. And her children had taken something from their father. They could draw, they could make things, but they all would look, and as they sat by the side of a fire in their good house, they would look at the picture that was scratched on a slate by their father with an old rusty nail. She would smile. "You did us all right. You kept me going. You've always been good to me." She never did get married again. She would keep that picture, even in the fine house, and remember the time before this time that she'd got a scratch upon the back of her hand that had given her an idea, that had put gold in her pockets and food and schooling for her children. The tapping on the window at 5:30 in the morning was just meant to wake up a father and a brother, but the tapping was so loud that it woke everybody up in the house, including this girl. She knew that she would never work down the pit because she was a girl, but she knew that she would have to do some work sometime. She was friendly, but not very strong, and right by the side of the mine she did the work that she could. She would cook. She would cook for her father's breakfast. She would make sure that she could give him something to eat before he went to work, and she would also cook so that those men who were finishing their shift would have something to eat for their breakfasts. Now, her father and her brothers did work in that place, and they did need to be knocked up at 5:30 in the morning. But the water that she would see in the streets was dirty, and the river water was dirty because it was filled with coal dust. It was filled with mud, because wherever there is industry, then water will become dirtied and polluted. She didn't really mind that much. She would use clean water in her cooking, but there was no point in her washing, not with dirty water. But now, it was a month before Christmas, and it had rained as it had never rained before, not in all of the time that she could remember. And she knew that the water level would be rising inside of the mine, and she wanted to say to her father and her brothers not to go down the pit, because the old steam engines that would chug and pull the water from out of the mine were built a long time ago, built when the mine shafts were first sunk. One of the other jobs that she could do in between cooking was to make coal briquettes. There would be pieces of coal dust that would be pushed and formed and into shape, and she would squeeze them and push them and pull down a great lever and make the coal briquettes that they could burn on their fire. Oh yes, I mean, they would get coal from the mine anyway. Her father would laugh. He would say that there was enough coal dust inside of his pit helmet to light the fire for the rest of the year. The girl, when it was dark in the morning, would sit and cook by candlelight. She would watch the candle wax as it would drip down. She would cook at night by candlelight. But she knew that the water level would be rising on this morning, a month before Christmas. And as the tap on the window had woken her and everyone else in the street up, she wanted to say to her father, as he pulled his pit helmet onto his head, and her brothers as they all got themselves ready, she wanted to say to them, please don't go down. There was something that she could feel. She didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was the fact that it was raining so hard, or that there was a breeze that pulled at the candle's flame. But she did want to say something to her father and her brothers, but it wouldn't have made any sense. Her father had just said, at least we'll have clean faces when we go down to the mine, for the rain was lashing at their faces and their clothes. But it wouldn't take them long, once they'd gone down into the pit, to take the jackets, the shirts off, and be down to the vests and the trousers, because it was so hot in that place. But at the end of the day, when she was cooking for her father's tea, she waited. And she waited. None of the men were coming back with their heavy boots rattling on the pavements. She could hear rumblings and roarings of voices in the streets, and it was louder than the rain that was falling. Her mother said to her, something's happened. I think that we should go down, just to see if everything's all right. They wrapped up her younger brother, for he was only about 18 months old, put him in a shawl, wrapped her inside of her coat, and her mother ran down the streets. This girl, she wasn't running, not with her baby brother inside of her coat. But when they got there, they weren't alone. All of the women were standing there. All of them were standing, the arms folded. It wasn't as if they were gossiping. There was a tone to their voices. The pits had flooded. The old steam engine that drew the water out was not drawing out the water fast enough. Parts of the pit had been flooded. You could hear the shouts of joy and screams of just happiness when some of the pitmen had got out and away from the floods, and everyone was waiting and watching the tallies being placed back, the tally discs that were hung to show who was in and who wasn't in the pit. But there was a great gap. Her father's disc wasn't there. Her brother's discs weren't there. This girl didn't know what to do. Right up till midnight, they were still trying to get the steam engine to work, still trying to get the men out. But this was an old shaft. She'd been listening to her grandfather. A grandfather had told her about how the men would walk down to the pit, how they could walk their way down instead of going down in the cages that were lowered down by the steam engines. This girl, she handed back her younger baby brother to her mother and remembered. She screwed her eyes up tight to try and remember as hard as she could the story that her grandfather had told her, whereabouts it was that the old entrance to the pit had been. And she wasn't sure, but she ran across the fields, and there she found an old wooden door with a rusty chain on it. She wondered. She ran back to the house and got the candle that she would do her cooking by, got it, guarded the flame, ran to that place, and she could see that if she was to push hard enough, the old hinges would break. And by herself she pushed and pulled at the doors, and eventually they came off. Now she had sweat on her brow and a small cut on the back of her hand, but with that candle's flame she could see that there was a red tone and a tinge to that flame. She knew that this was a dangerous place to go, for when a candle flame did not burn the way that it should do, bright and yellow, she knew that there would be coal damp in the air, and this would be a second disaster. She snubbed out the flame and waited until her eyes got used to what little light was starting to creep into that old part of the old shaft, and she screamed, "Dad!" She wasn't sure, but she could hear a tick-tack tapping. There was no way that she could have pulled all of the stones away, but she did run back. She called to all of the women. "I think that there's a way that we can get the men out." They didn't hesitate, they didn't question her. Any sign of hope would be brighter than a candle's flame. They went down that place. They were wondering as they went past the broken gates how this had happened. But with them working, one with another, they pulled the stones away. They could feel water on their hands. And it was then that they saw what they had hoped they would see. Men's faces. Cleaner. Cleaner than they'd ever been. Cleaner than they'd ever been, but free. It was one of the last of the men to come out of the pit. From that place that the women had dug out was her father and her brothers. He looked at her and said, "You've been listening to your granddad's stories, haven't you? I've got something for you." When it came to the next payday, her father didn't wait for a wink or a blink. He took his wages, and all of the copper coins that were inside of that bag he gave to his daughter. She had never had so much money in all of her life. And when it was Christmas Day, all of the family were surprised, for she bought for each and every one person in a family, a beautiful Christmas candle.
From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. No one talks of danger underneath the ground, where the heartbeat of this nation of that work can be found. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. Once there was a mine here, but now the pit end's gone. There's no more working underground, but the memory lingers on. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families and workmates brought the light from the dark. Now the pit end's closing, Mother Nature takes a hand. There's no more filthy slag heaps in this green and pleasant land. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families and workmates brought the light from the dark. If you don't change a thing, then nothing will ever change. Take hold of your own future, you've everything to gain. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families and workmates brought the light from the dark. There's no nets, no fish to catch down by the shore. Shout loud the name of Wansbeck, we'll make it work once more. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families and workmates brought the light from the dark. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families and workmates brought the light from the dark. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the dark